You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. I'm your host Gunter, and today we're going to delve a little bit more deeply into the roots of family communication and the surprising impacts of household chaos on adolescent mood. So buckle up. This particular episode might be quite a revelation. So in a recent study in the Journal of Family Psychology, led by psychologist Jackie Nelson from the University of Texas, they presented compelling evidence about the detrimental effects of chaotic homes on family interactions. So if we put this in context, one of the big things, especially after the last episode of this podcast, I talked about, like kids in crisis and how we've got constantly an issue with kids' mental health. Well, this thing came across my desk quite timely fashion in that, we can talk about a lot of different variables that might impact on a child or a teenager's mental health. But the thing that we don't necessarily talk about is like the family environment, the sort of levels of stress in the family. And in this particular journal, they're looking at the sort of the busyness, the clutter, the noise, and the lack of routine that can exist in a teen's home. So let's just take a quick look at trying to understand what Nelson's actually revealed about the core of this issue. And in her words, it's not just about the clutter, noise, and lack of routine. It's how these factors culminate in unpredictability and tension, leading ultimately to the compromise of family functioning. So let's take a look at this. Let's talk about stressful environments. Now, what are some of the impacts of this? Well, the first one that we get out of this article is how it depletes parents' regulatory abilities. And that is emotional regulation, first and foremost. And that makes it challenging for them to remain positively engaged with their children throughout the day. But one of the things that we need to consider is that the adult's challenge with emotional regulation, or including behavioural regulation, goes much, much further than simply making teenagers tense. One of the things that they found was that it increases the risks of a greater susceptibility to substance abuse, lower self-esteem, self-doubt, and hesitation in discussing sensitive topics due to trust issues. So this is particularly enlightening in many respects. So if we paint a picture of the family home environment as being high stress, high E, and lacking predictability and structure, then we're going to see quite a substantial negative impact on the teen's mental health. So the study centered around conversations of 109 mother-adolescent pairs across the week. And Nelson highlighted the significance of adolescent disclosure. In other words, how frequently do teens engage to open up? And so by this, she refers to the information teenagers voluntarily share with their parents. And that, in particular, is essential for parental awareness. You know, the stuff that you want to know about what your kid's getting up to and what they're going through and how they're reacting to stuff around them. So think about it. How often have you heard of teenagers withholding information or lying when parents initiate conversations? So spontaneous disclosure becomes a crucial factor in ensuring transparent dialogue. Now, what stood out most from these findings is that the household chaos directly decreases engagement between mothers and teenagers. This disengagement, in turn, reduces spontaneous sharing and understanding. In other words, the chaotic environments obstruct paths of connections. So you've heard me talk about, Dr. Mark Williams' work on the connected species. Well, here is a classic and fundamental example of this stuff at work. But there's also a silver lining, the part where we can inspire change. So what do we do to enhance communication and bolster relationships? Well, fundamentally, in a way, it's really simple. Families need to reduce chaos and cultivate a predictable, calm, and supportive environment. So the question is, how do you do that? Now, in my book, one of the things I talk a lot about, firstly, is that we need to form attachment relationships. We need to be available for our children to be able to have access to us, and obviously there's some restrictions around that because, we all have stuff to do, but it's the vibe that, in a sense, we give off at that point. So we also need to be consistent in our behaviour, and as well as with our emotional regulation, and we need to be consistent with our sort of expectations and values and opportunities that we have as a family to come together. So, out of this research, some simple things came about. So the suggestion is, so how do we enhance our predictable, calm, and supportive environment? Well, firstly, they suggest to dine together at regular times. Now, I personally am a big believer in this. I think that meals, as much as possible, should be in a shared space. Obviously, breakfast, generally speaking, might be a bit of a runaround, but definitely dinner. And this needs to take place without the distraction of devices. TV, music. This is a space where we really have the opportunity to open up together and share. There's also room to dedicate moments for family connections, possibly each evening. Now, again, if we're going to do dinner together, that's almost a given. But sometimes what we need is maybe a little bit more, like a family meeting once a week. And the other part of it is to prioritise regular family bonding moments. Remember those days before everybody hopped on TV, computers and other devices? We'd have a games night. You'd play Scrabble or Monopoly or something like that. So everyone in the family got invited around the table, and this is what we do. So it's really, in a sense, very simple, and that is that we establish consistent routines and dedicate time together that can bridge this communication gap. The study also made an interesting observation about gender dynamics. And this is probably going to be preaching to the converted, but girls generally shared more than boys. And there was a slight dip in adolescent openness as the week rolled on. So Nelson's ongoing research aims to explore communication topics between teens and parents and the dynamics influenced by family size and culture. So I'm really keen to wait and see what comes out of this, because intuitively I've got some ideas and I'll possibly share those as we go along. But the important thing is that we need to quieten our spaces down. You know, a large part of what I deal with in my practice with teenagers is parents who are overloaded, stressed to the max, and who essentially are like events coordinators with their teenagers or homework inspectors. And so there's not a lot of room to actually connect properly in an empathic and calm way. I mean, there's often two major hotspots. One is getting out of the house in the morning, and secondly, the afternoon, evening chaos of trying to get everything prepared, especially if you've got a teenager, but also you've got someone who's, a smaller child, a younger child. So, a lot of this stuff requires some intent, and it's not going to be easy. It's going to take some real thinking and planning ahead of time. And it also is useful in my book to involve the teenager in making some of those changes. Now, you may encounter some resistance in the beginning, but by and large, over time, I think this is going to yield some really positive changes. So the takeout here is that families can evolve and adapt. We can create the right spaces for communication. So let's take Nelson's study and put it into practice. Let's use that knowledge and let's create environments that ensure that our teenagers feel safe and understood and can open up to us. So on that note, let me thank you for joining me again today. And remember, harmonious households can lead to harmonious relationships. So until next time, inspire change and nurture bonds.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.